Nora lunged at him with untamed fury. The lamp was already in motion, swinging toward Wu Bin's head with all the fury of her grief, when Nora saw her father's face on the television screen behind him. Dead. Murdered. And Wu Bin had known. You bastard. The scream tore from her throat as the lamp arced through the air. But before she could land a strike, Wu Bin disarmed her, effortlessly. One moment Nora was swinging the lamp with all her grief-fueled rage, and the next Wu Bin had twisted it from her grip and slammed her back against the wall. Not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to trap. His forearm pressed across her collarbone, pinning her in place. His face was inches from hers, those cold dark eyes boring into her with an intensity that stole her breath. You must think your father is some sort of saint, he said, his voice low and lethal. Undeserving of death after all he's done. I'd say he got a rather comfortable death, all things considered. Nora's face contorted, shock, rage, disbelief warring across her features. The absurdity of his words, the casual cruelty, the way he spoke about her father's murder like it was a mercy. What kind of monster are you? The words tore from her throat, raw and broken. Wu Bin's jaw tightened. For just a flash, so brief she almost missed it, something flickered behind his eyes. Pain. Old and buried deep. But then it was gone, replaced by that impenetrable mask of ice. The kind that's letting you live, he said quietly. His voice dropped even lower, dangerous. But I can be so much more than that if I have to be. The threat hung between them, heavy and suffocating. But there was something else in his tone. Something that made Nora pause even through her grief. His voice wasn't just cold, it was pissed. Strained. Like he was holding something back with every ounce of control he possessed. Like her words had hit a nerve she didn't know existed. He released her abruptly and stepped back, adjusting his cuffs with sharp, precise movements. The cool mask slid back into place as if it had never cracked. Cry it out, he said, his tone returning to that businesslike detachment. We have a gala tonight. You need to look perfect. Then he walked out of the study, his footsteps measured and calm, leaving her standing there against the wall, gasping for air. He hadn't denied killing her father. But he hadn't confirmed it either. The ambiguity was somehow worse than either truth would have been. Nora's legs gave out. She slid down the wall until she hit the floor, her body folding in on itself as the sobs finally broke free. Huge, wrenching sounds that tore from somewhere deep in her chest. She cried for her father, complicated and distant as he'd been. She cried for herself, for the life she'd lost in the span of a single day. She cried for the sister who'd abandoned her and the future that had been stolen. She cursed her fate. Cursed the invitation that had brought her here. Cursed her father for whatever he'd done that had led to this nightmare. Cursed herself for being naive enough to think attending a wedding would be simple. If only she'd known. If only she'd seen this coming. Her life had been turned upside down and inside out in less than 48 hours, and now her father was dead, murdered, and she'd never get answers. Never understand what debt he'd incurred or why she was paying the price for it. The tears came until there were no more left. Until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen and her body was so exhausted it simply shut down. She didn't remember closing her eyes. Didn't remember sleep claiming her there on the cold study floor. But when she woke, everything had changed. The first thing Nora registered was softness. Not the hard floor beneath her cheek, but a mattress. Pillows. The familiar scent of the guest room she'd been given. She blinked slowly, disoriented, her eyes gritty and painful from crying. Sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, afternoon light, golden and slanting. How long had she been out? Nora sat up carefully, her head pounding, her body aching like she'd been hit by a truck. She was on the bed. Still wearing the jeans and t-shirt from that morning, but someone had removed her shoes. A glass of water sat on the nightstand beside her, condensation beading on the outside. Fresh. Recently placed. She hadn't walked here. Which meant. The image materialized unbidden, Wu Bin, lifting her unconscious body from the study floor, carrying her down the hallway, placing her on the bed with care that contradicted every cold word he'd spoken. Nora shook her head, trying to dislodge the thought. It didn't matter. It couldn't matter. He was still a monster. Still her captor. Still possibly her father's murderer. The fact that he'd carried her to bed instead of leaving her on the floor didn't change anything. It doesn't, she told herself firmly, even as something uncomfortable twisted in her chest. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. Mrs. Shin? Minji's voice, professional and brisk. May I come in? Nora didn't answer, but the door opened anyway. Minji stepped inside, immaculate as always in her black pantsuit, tablet tucked under one arm. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes swept over Nora with something that might have been sympathy. Might have been. Mr. Shin has instructed me to take you shopping, Minji said without preamble. You'll need appropriate attire for tonight's gala. We have 3 hours. Nora stared at her, the words not quite penetrating the fog in her brain. Shopping. Her voice came out hoarse, barely recognizable. Yes. There's a private boutique in Qingdamdong that. My father is dead. Nora cut her off, the words sharp and bitter. He died less than 24 hours ago. And your boss wants me to go shopping? Minji's expression didn't change. I understand this is difficult. Difficult. Nora let out a laugh that sounded unhinged even to her own ears. My father was murdered. And instead of letting me mourn, instead of giving me even a single day to process this, he's making me put on a dress and play pretend at some party. She stood, her hands shaking with renewed fury. Only a lunatic would do something like this. Only a complete psychopath. Mrs. Shin. Minji's voice was sharp now, cutting through Nora's spiraling rage. I understand you're grieving. But Mr. Shin's instructions are clear. You will attend the gala tonight. You will look appropriate. And you will play your role. Or what? Nora challenged. He'll feed me to his wolves too. Minji was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those calculating eyes. No, she said finally, and her voice was surprisingly gentle. But there will be over 300 guests at tonight's event. Politicians. Business leaders. People with connections to law enforcement, media, and international networks. If you want answers about your father's death, if you want to understand what you've been pulled into, that gala is where you'll find them. She paused, letting that sink in. You can stay here and grieve alone in this penthouse, learning nothing, trapped with your questions. Or you can come with me, play the part Mr. Shin needs you to play, and start gathering the information you need to survive this. Your choice. Nora's anger faltered, replaced by something colder and more calculating. Minji was right. Sitting here drowning in grief and rage wouldn't give her answers. Wouldn't help her understand the blood debt or her father's role in all this. Wouldn't help her figure out who really killed him or why. But going to this gala, being in a room full of Seoul's elite, the same circles Woo Bin moved in, that was an opportunity. A chance to observe. To listen. To maybe, find a crack in the prison walls surrounding her. She met Minji's gaze, seeing a flicker of something almost like approval there. Fine, Nora said, her voice flat. Let's go shopping. But inside, a new resolve was hardening. If Woo Bin wanted her to play the perfect wife, she'd play the part. And while she was playing, she'd figure out exactly what game he was running and how to beat him at it. The shopping trip passed in a haze. Nora moved through it mechanically, her mind still replaying the study confrontation on an endless loop. The way Woo Bin had slammed her against the wall. The pain in his voice when she'd called him a monster. Her father's face on that news screen. He got a rather comfortable death, all things considered. What did that even mean? Minji guided her through Qingdamdong's luxury district with practiced efficiency. They stopped at a boutique Nora had only ever seen in magazines, the kind of place where a single dress cost more than she used to make in 6 months. The staff materialized the moment they arrived, and Nora realized with a jolt that the entire store was empty except for them. Mr. Shin booked the boutique for the afternoon, Minji explained, as if chartering an entire luxury store was perfectly normal. He thought you'd prefer privacy. Nora wanted to laugh. Or scream. She wasn't sure which. Woo Bin had cleared out one of the most expensive clothing lines in the world. For her. Hours after she tried to brain him with a lamp. Hours after learning her father was dead. The man was unfathomable. Dresses appeared in an endless stream: silk, satin, lace, designs so elegant they looked like wearable art. The staff fluttered around her with tape measures and pins, speaking in rapid Korean she couldn't follow. Minji translated occasionally, but mostly Nora just nodded and let herself be dressed and undressed like a doll. When they finally selected a gown midnight blue that somehow made her dark skin glow, with a neckline that was elegant without being revealing, Minji whisked her away to a luxury spa. Mr. Shin's instructions, was all she said. The spa was just as excessive. Private treatment rooms. Estheticians who worked in reverent silence. A massage that should have been relaxing but only made Nora more tense because she couldn't stop thinking. He was trying to soothe her. In his twisted, roundabout way, Woobin was trying to, what? Apologize. Comfort her. Make her feel better about being his prisoner. Everything he did confused her. Contradicted itself. He was cruel and cold one moment, then ordering spa treatments the next. He threatened her sister with wolves, then carried Nora to bed when she passed out from grief. She didn't understand him. And that terrified her almost as much as everything else. By the time Nora stood in front of the full-length mirror in her guest room, evening had fallen over Seoul. The woman looking back at her was unrecognizable. The midnight blue gown hugged her figure perfectly, the fabric shimmering subtly under the light. Her box braids had been styled into an elegant updo, a few artful strands framing her face. The makeup artists had worked magic, covering the evidence of her crying, making her eyes look luminous instead of swollen, painting her lips a deep wine red that matched the confidence she absolutely didn't feel. She looked like she belonged in Woobin's world. She looked like Mrs. Shin. The thought made her stomach turn. A knock at the door. Mrs. Shin? Mr. Shin is waiting. Nora took a breath, steadied herself, and opened the door. Woobin stood in the living room, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. He'd changed into a black tuxedo different from the wedding, somehow even more devastating. Everything about him was sharp, precise, dangerous. His hair was perfectly styled. His bow tie was immaculate. He looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread about Seoul's most powerful bachelors. But it was the way he was looking at her that made Nora's breath catch. His eyes moved over her slowly, taking in the dress, the styling, her face, and something shifted in his expression. The cold mask slipped, just for a heartbeat, and what she saw underneath made her pulse jump. Hunger. Raw, undisguised want. He looked at her like he wanted to devour her. Like she was the only thing in the room worth looking at. Like. Nora shook herself mentally. No. She was imagining things. Had to be. This was the same man who'd threatened her hours ago, who'd called her father's death comfortable. He couldn't possibly. You look appropriate, Woobin said, his voice carefully neutral again, the moment gone so quickly she wondered if she'd hallucinated it. Appropriate. Not beautiful. Not stunning. Appropriate. Of course. He crossed to her in 3 strides, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtly spiced. His hand came to rest on the small of her back, warm through the thin fabric of her dress. Don't do anything stupid, he said quietly, his lips close to her ear. And play along. It wasn't a request. Then he was guiding her toward the elevator, his hand never leaving her back, proprietary and possessive. Nora's mind spun with 1,000 retorts, but she swallowed them all. Play along, Minji had said. Gather information. Survive. She could do this. She had to do this. The charity gala was held at the Schiller Hotel's grand ballroom, and the moment Nora stepped inside, she understood exactly how far out of her depth she was. The space was breathtaking, soaring ceilings with crystal chandeliers the size of cars, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of Seoul's glittering skyline. Everything dripped with wealth, the ice sculptures, the champagne towers, the live orchestra playing in the corner, the centerpieces that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. But it was the people that made Nora's stomach drop. She recognized faces from news broadcasts. That politician who'd been in talks with the UN. That actress whose films had won international awards. That tech billionaire whose company was worth more than some country's GDP. CEOs in custom suits. Socialites in couture gowns. Old money and new money mingling with the ease of people who'd never worried about anything as mundane as a bank balance. These were the people who shaped the world with phone calls and signatures. And Nora was supposed to walk among them like she belonged. Woobin's hand tightened fractionally on her back, a warning or encouragement, she couldn't tell. Smile, he murmured. You're Mrs. Shin now. Act like it. Heads were already turning. Whispers following in their wake. Isn't that the one who replaced? Heard she's Nigerian. Wonder what happened to the other sister. Nora lifted her chin and forced her lips into something resembling a smile, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Wu Bin guided her deeper into the ballroom with the confidence of someone who owned every room he entered. People parted for them automatically. Some nodded respectfully. Others openly stared. Shinsai, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, approached, bowing slightly. Congratulations on your marriage. Thank you, Director Kim. Wu Bin's voice was smooth, perfectly polite. Allow me to introduce my wife, Nora. The man's eyes flickered over her with barely concealed curiosity. A pleasure, Mrs. Shin. Nora nodded, not trusting her voice. More introductions followed in rapid succession. Names and titles she couldn't possibly remember. Faces that blurred together. Everyone was polite, but she could feel their assessment. Their judgment. The foreign woman who'd somehow landed one of Seoul's most eligible bachelors. The replacement bride. The curiosity. It was suffocating. 20 minutes in, Wu Bin was drawn into a conversation with a group of older men, business associates, from the sound of it. Talk of mergers and acquisitions and market shares. His hand fell away from her back as he turned to engage fully with them. For the first time since arriving, Nora was alone. Well, not alone, surrounded by hundreds of people. But no longer under Wu Bin's direct supervision. This was her chance. She drifted away slowly, trying to look casual, like she was simply admiring the decor. Her eyes scanned the ballroom, looking for, what? She didn't even know. Information. Clues. Anything that might help her understand what she'd been dragged into. She made it to the edge of the ballroom, near a quieter corridor lined with what looked like private meeting rooms, when a voice stopped her cold. So you are the godforsaken foreign wench. Nora spun around. The woman standing before her was elderly, perhaps late 60s, but carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. She wore a deep burgundy gown that probably cost more than a car, with diamonds at her throat and wrists that caught the light like captured stars. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless, her expression carved from ice. But it was her eyes that made Nora's blood run cold. They held such contempt. Such absolute, undisguised hatred. Nora stammered, confused, and suddenly very aware that people nearby were starting to notice the confrontation. Conversations were trailing off. Heads turning. I think you have the wrong person. The old woman's laugh was sharp and cutting. Oh, I have exactly the right person. You must be over the moon, mustn't you? Struck it rich with my son? My son. Oh God. This was Wu Bin's mother. Nora's mind raced. She hadn't seen any family at the wedding, not his mother, not anyone. Just Wu Bin, cold and alone at that altar. The crowd around them was growing. Curious faces. Whispered speculation. Nora felt heat crawling up her neck, embarrassment and confusion warring in her chest. I'm sorry, I don't, she tried again, keeping her voice polite, desperately trying to de-escalate. There's no misunderstanding. Madam Shin stepped closer, her voice rising just enough to ensure everyone nearby could hear. You're nothing but a cheap replacement. A substitution for the daughter who had the sense to run. And I'll make you regret ever stepping foot in my family. The ballroom had gone quiet now. Or maybe it just felt that way because all Nora could hear was the blood rushing in her ears. All she could feel was the weight of dozens, hundreds of eyes on her. Watching. Judging. She stood frozen, mortified, unsure what to do or say. How do you even respond to being publicly eviscerated by your husband's mother at your first social event? I'm glad I didn't bother attending that horrible event. The sight of watching such a girl marry my son would have given me nightmares. That's enough. The voice cut through the tension like a blade. Wu Bin. He materialized at Nora's side so quickly she hadn't even seen him approach. His hand found hers, warm, solid, steady, and suddenly she could breathe again. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes were cold fire. Wu Bin, his mother started, her expression shifting to something almost uncertain. She's my wife, he cut her off, his voice quiet but carrying across the now silent ballroom. And nothing is going to change that. Not you. Not anyone. He stepped forward slightly, still holding Nora's hand, positioning himself subtly between her and his mother. "Be careful what you say, mother." His voice dropped even lower, dangerous. "Or I'll forget you ever existed." The threat hung in the air, shocking in its directness. Madam Shin's mouth opened, then closed. Words seemed to stick in her throat. She looked between her son and Nora, and for the first time, something like shock crossed her features. As if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. That her son, was choosing this foreign woman over her. Standing against his own mother. For a girl he'd known less than 48 hours. "She's my wife," Wu Bin repeated, and there was steel in his voice now. "And I will not stand for disrespect toward her. From anyone. Is that understood?" The silence was deafening. His mother stood frozen, her face cycling through emotions Nora couldn't quite read: shock, anger, something that might have been hurt. But she said nothing. Did nothing. Just stared at her son like he'd become a stranger. Wu Bin turned to Nora, and his expression softened infinitesimally. "We're done here. Let's go home." And then he was pulling her away, his hand never leaving hers, cutting through the crowd that parted like water around them. Nora's mind was spinning. What had just happened? Why had he defended her like that? Stood against his own mother in public, in front of Seoul's elite, for a woman he'd forced into marriage? After everything he'd done. After the threats. After possibly killing her father. After slamming her against a wall just hours ago. Why would he protect her now? Her chest felt tight. Emotions she couldn't name were churning inside her: confusion, gratitude, anger, something dangerously close to hope. He'd made her feel seen. Protected. Like she mattered. By the same man who'd stolen her life. The same monster who'd threatened to feed her sister to wolves. The contradiction was making her dizzy. They were in the elevator now, descending toward the parking garage. Wu Bin still held her hand, his thumb moving absently across her knuckles in a gesture that seemed unconscious. Nora opened her mouth. Closed it. Tried again. "Why?" Her voice came out rough. "Why did you do that?" Wu Bin didn't look at her. Just kept staring straight ahead at the elevator doors, his jaw tight. "Do what?" "Defend me. Against your mother. In front of everyone." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Because you're my wife. I'm your prisoner. You're both." He finally turned to look at her, and the intensity in his eyes stole her breath. "And what's mine stays protected. That includes you." The elevator doors opened. Wu Bin released her hand and walked toward the waiting car, leaving Nora standing there with a heart that wouldn't stop racing and thoughts that wouldn't stop spiraling. She felt protected by the monster who'd forced her into this cage. And she had no idea what that made her. That night, Nora lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, exhaustion pulling at her limbs but sleep refusing to come. Her mind was a storm of questions with no answers. The gala replayed in fragments: Wu Bin's mother's venom, the whispers of the crowd, the way he defended her without hesitation. His hand in hers, solid and steady. His words: "What's mine stays protected." But what did that even mean? She was his prisoner. His substitute bride. A pawn in some revenge game she didn't understand. Yet he'd stood between her and his own mother like she was something worth protecting. The contradiction gnawed at her, relentless and confusing. And underneath it all, the question that wouldn't stop echoing: did he kill my father? If he had, why keep her alive? What purpose did she serve beyond being collateral, a living reminder of the Okonkwo family's sins? But if he hadn't, if someone else was responsible, then why wouldn't he just tell her? Why the evasions, the careful non-answers, the way he looked at her sometimes like he was fighting something inside himself? Wu Bin was elusive. Deliberately so. Like he had no intention of giving her the truth, for reasons beyond her comprehension. Nora rolled onto her side, frustration coiling tight in her chest. One thing seemed clear, though clearer with each passing hour. If he'd had anything to do with her father's death, he probably would have no reason keeping her alive. She'd be a loose end. A liability. Already buried in some unmarked grave like the men who'd attacked the penthouse. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it just raised more questions. She must have dozed eventually, because when she opened her eyes again, the clock read 2:47 a.m. Her throat was dry, scratchy. She needed water. Nora slipped out of bed, padding barefoot across the carpet. She'd pulled on a silk robe over her sleep shorts and tank top, one of the many items that had mysteriously appeared in her closet over the past weeks. Everything in her size. Everything expensive. Everything chosen by someone who'd paid attention to what she might like. The penthouse was dark except for the city lights filtering through the massive windows. Seoul never truly slept. The glow from below painted everything in shades of blue and gold. Nora made her way down the hallway toward the kitchen, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet. The living room stretched before her, vast and empty, furniture casting long shadows. She turned the corner and froze. Woobin stood at the kitchen counter, shirtless. The breath left Nora's lungs in a soft gasp. She took an involuntary step backward, her brain short-circuiting. God, he was beautiful in a way that seemed almost unfair. Lean muscle defined every line of his torso, shoulders broad and strong, chest sculpted, abs that looked carved from marble. His skin was pale in the dim light, smooth except for a few scars she could just make out. Battle marks. Evidence of a life lived dangerously. He stood with his back partially to her, one hand wrapped around a coffee mug, his sweatpants riding low on his hips in a way that made her mouth go dry for reasons that had nothing to do with thirst. Nora's heart hammered. Heat flooded her face, her neck, spreading down her body like wildfire. What is wrong with you? She thought desperately. This man is your captor. But her body wasn't listening to logic. It was responding to the sight of him with a visceral, undeniable reaction that terrified her. She tried to back away slowly, quietly, before he noticed. There's no need to do that. His voice cut through the silence. He hadn't turned, but somehow he knew she was there. Woobin lifted his head slightly, and she caught his profile, sharp jawline, the elegant line of his neck. I don't bite. The words should have been reassuring. Instead, they sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. He turned then, facing her fully, and the divine perfection of his body coming into full view made something wake inside Nora. Something deeper. A thirst she didn't know existed, had never felt before. It was like her brain had rewired itself in that moment, every synapse firing in a new direction. No, she told herself firmly. No. Woobin set down his mug and began walking toward her. Each step was measured, unhurried, predatory in its grace. Nora's pulse jumped. She tensed, every muscle in her body coiling tight. She should run. Should turn and flee back to her room and lock the door and forget she'd ever seen. Her heel caught the edge of the carpet. The world tilted. She was falling. And then he caught her. His arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her against him with effortless strength. Steadying her. His other hand came up to brace her shoulder. They were pressed together now. Her palms flat against his bare chest, feeling the heat of his skin, the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers. His arm around her waist, holding her like she belonged there. A gasp escaped her lips. Careful, he murmured, and his voice was lower now, rougher. Nora looked up, and found his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that stole whatever breath she had left. Dark eyes. Unreadable. But burning with something she recognized because she felt it echoing in her own chest. He moved slowly, deliberately, pushing aside the braid that had fallen across her face. His fingers lingered, coming to rest on the side of her neck. His thumb traced the line of her jaw with a gentleness that contradicted everything she thought she knew about him. A forbidden sensation swept through every inch of her body. Electric. Overwhelming. Wrong and right at the same time. Are you okay? Woobin asked, and she could feel his words as much as hear them. The heat of his body seeping into hers, burning away rational thought. Nora nodded. She tried to speak, but the words were lost somewhere in the pit of her mind, drowned out by the thundering of her heart and the feeling of his hands on her skin. And then he did it. His lips landed softly against hers. The kiss was gentle. Testing. Like he was giving her a chance to pull away, to reject him, to remember all the reasons this was wrong. But Nora didn't resist. She wanted it. Wanted him, in a way that defied every logical thought in her head. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her, his eyes searching her face for something, permission, maybe, or confirmation that she wasn't about to shove him away. This time, Nora went in for the kiss. Her hands slid up his chest to his shoulders, pulling him closer. His arm tightened around her waist, his other hand threading into her braids. This kiss was deeper, longer, less gentle. There was hunger in it, his and hers, weeks of tension and confusion and proximity finally finding an outlet. When their lips finally parted, they were both breathing hard. His forehead rested against hers, and the tension that had been coiling between them since that first day seemed to unspool, replaced by something else. Something quieter but no less intense. Nora's mind was spinning. This was insane. She was kissing the man who'd forced her into marriage, who'd threatened her sister, who might have killed her father. "Why won't you tell me what happened to my father?" The words tumbled out in a soft breath before she could stop them. The shift was immediate. Woobin went still. The warmth in his expression iced over, replaced by that familiar guarded mask. He looked into her eyes, her determined, pleading eyes, and for a moment she thought she saw something crack. Like he wanted to tell her. Like the truth was right there, pressing against his lips, desperate to break free. But then he straightened, steadying her gently before stepping back. The loss of his warmth felt like a physical blow. Woobin walked toward the counter, putting distance between them. Avoiding her gaze. Avoiding the question. He picked up his coffee mug, cradling it like a shield. "I just want to know." Nora's voice rose, frustration and hurt bleeding through. I need to understand." "And then what?" Woobin interrupted, finally turning to look at her. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was hard. "You learn the truth, and then what, Nora? What does it change?" "Everything," she said desperately. "It changes everything. It would do you no good to know." His tone was final. Dismissive. He moved toward the hallway, clearly intending to walk away, to end this conversation before it could go any further. "Wait," Nora started, taking a step toward him. But he was already gone, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen. Nora stood there, chest heaving, a tangle of emotions she couldn't name churning inside her. Regret crashed over her in waves. She'd ruined the moment. Shattered whatever fragile connection had formed between them with her desperate need for answers. She felt stupid. Foolish. For thinking that in a situation like this, trapped in a gilded cage with a man who held all the power, she could have both truth and, whatever that had been, comfort, desire, something almost like trust. But how could she trust him when he wouldn't even give her the most basic truth? What was he hiding? And why? She couldn't tell. But time would. It had to. The weeks that followed were strange. An odd couple navigating an odd relationship. Woobin didn't bring up the kitchen encounter, and neither did Nora. But something had shifted between them, subtle, almost imperceptible, but then nonetheless. He was still cold. Still controlled. Still gave her orders through Minji about appearances and schedules. But occasionally, she'd catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Sometimes his hand would linger a moment too long when he helped her out of the car. Once, she'd fallen asleep on the couch reading, and she'd woken up covered with a blanket she definitely hadn't gotten herself. Small things. Insignificant things. Things that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. Minji became something like a friend, or at least, an ally. She taught Nora how to navigate Seoul's high society, how to deflect invasive questions at events, how to present herself as Mrs. Shin without losing herself entirely. They went shopping occasionally, attended charity luncheons, visited art galleries and exclusive boutiques. It was a life Nora never could have imagined. Surreal and suffocating and occasionally almost pleasant, in a way that made her feel guilty. Her father was dead. She was a prisoner. But sometimes, just sometimes, she almost forgot. The attack came on a Thursday afternoon. Nora and Minji had spent the morning at a boutique in Apguge, selecting pieces for an upcoming corporate event. The security detail that usually shadowed them had been reduced, just 2 men instead of the usual 4. Woobin had deemed it safe enough for a routine shopping trip. That was the mistake. They were walking back to the car, arms laden with shopping bags, Minji laughing at something Nora had said about the absurdity of $1,000 shoes. The van came out of nowhere. It screeched to a halt beside them, side door flying open. Men in black masks poured out, 3, 4, maybe more. Nora couldn't tell because everything was happening too fast. Woobin's security reacted immediately, reaching for weapons, shouting in Korean. But the attackers were faster. Gunshots cracked through the air. One of the guards went down. The other was slammed against the car, disarmed in seconds. Hands grabbed Nora, rough, brutal, dragging her toward the van. She screamed, fought, tried to dig her heels into the pavement, but there were too many of them. Nora, Minji's voice, desperate and terrified. More gunshots. Shouting. Chaos. And then Nora was being thrown into the van, her head slamming against the metal floor. Pain exploded through her skull. Her vision swam. She heard the door slam. Felt the van lurch into motion. Felt hands grabbing her again, rougher this time, shoving something over her head, fabric, a bag, plunging her into darkness. She couldn't see. Couldn't breathe properly. Panic clawed at her throat. "Don't fight," a voice said in accented English. "Make this harder and you die." Nora went limp, her mind racing even as her body stopped struggling. Wubin was right. The danger was real. And now she was being taken. By who? For what purpose? The van drove for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Nora tried to track the turns, tried to remember everything Wubin's security had taught her about abduction scenarios. But her head was throbbing. Her thoughts were scattered. And she was so scared. Finally, the van stopped. Hands grabbed her again, hauling her out. She stumbled, nearly fell, was half carried, half dragged across what felt like pavement, then through a door. The temperature changed, cooler. Inside somewhere. She was shoved into a chair. Her hands were zip-tied behind her back, the plastic cutting into her wrists. And then, silence. Footsteps. Someone walking around her. Circling. Nora's breath came in short, panicked gasps against the fabric covering her face. "Please," she started, her voice muffled. "Please, I don't." "Sure." A woman's voice. Calm. Almost amused. Fingers touched the bag over Nora's head. Slowly, deliberately, the fabric was lifted away. Light flooded Nora's vision. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus, trying to see. And then the world stopped. Because standing in front of her, arms crossed, expression cold and calculating, was a woman she'd known her entire life. A woman she'd trusted. Loved. Mourned. "Hello, sister," Zara said, her voice carrying that unmistakable lilt Nora had grown up hearing. The voice that used to comfort her when they were children. The voice that had disappeared from her life 3 years ago. Zara looked different, thinner, sharper, her hair cut into a sleek bob instead of the long curls Nora remembered. She wore all black, expensive and practical, and there was something hard in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and Nora had just been too naive to see it. "Zara," Nora's voice cracked, disbelief